Hello, this is Arlo Kilpatrick, the erudite Kinophile, and I am going to go over some more of Hani Miletski's book, Understanding Bestiality and Zoophilia. Today I'll be going over the chapter on the sexual history of these people not related to zoophilia. And I'll just warn you now that this is going to be a relatively stat-heavy episode, so if you don't like numbers, just mute this. And basically, the graphs will tell enough of the story that I don't have to go into it that much. So let's move on to the first part of this. When it comes to sexual education, how people learned about sex, the zoophiles, at least the men and also the women, tended to learn about it from the same sources that most people do, from books and from their peers. There were others who learned about this stuff from their first sexual relationships or from classes at school or whatever. But for the most part, the sexual education is pretty typical of ordinary people. The same is also clearly true of women. Now, when it came to when they learned about sexual matters, well, first, before I get into that, I'm just going to explain what the graph looks like. Essentially, the bar on this graph represents the average age at which they learned about these various sexual matters. And the sort of error bars, which are pictured with that, are there to tell you the standard deviation among people who have sex with animals in this study of these various ages. So, for example, when it came to learning about masturbation, on average, people learned about it at about the age of 10, and there was a standard deviation of 2.74 years. So, roughly speaking, most of them learned about it between the ages of 7 and 13. And of course, the other ages are pretty much self-explanatory. The only interesting thing, and the thing which makes this group different from others of the same type, is that they learned about sex with animals relatively early. And interestingly enough, they didn't learn that other people do have sex with animals until much later. And actually, some of them didn't even learn that there were other people who had sex with animals until the age of 50 or so. Now, with the women, there was a lot less variation, mainly because there were a lot less women involved in the study. But they had basically the same experience. They learned about sex pretty much at the same time as ordinary people. And there was a lot of variation on when they learned about sex with animals, as well as when they learned about other people having sex with animals. I found it interesting that the average age when they learned that other people had sex with animals, women anyway, was around the age of 25. I guess it's somehow less acceptable and so harder to learn about, but I find it interesting that it took them that long to figure that out. Next, a small discussion of their first orgasms, and I'm not going to go into much detail here because really I don't need to, but most of them got their first orgasms through the act of masturbation. Some of them got it through animal contact or with men during sleep. And the other categories are also available in these pie charts, but essentially they got their first orgasm the way that most people do, by playing with themselves, for the most part. And speaking of playing with themselves, when did they first start to masturbate? Well, the men first started masturbating around the age of 11, plus or minus 2.5 years. And women started slightly earlier, at 10.8 years, with a standard deviation which is higher at about 3. Most of them learned to masturbate at the age of 12 or so. And really there's not much to say about that. Likewise, their first heterosexual intercourse was pretty typical of a sort of standard history. They seemed to first have their sexual intercourse at around the age of 17 or 18. Those who did have heterosexual intercourse, that is. There was a substantial number, 15 or so men and 2 women, who had never had heterosexual intercourse. But of those that did, they learned about how to do it, essentially the same age that everyone else was doing it. So it's not as though these people were unable to find human partners, for the most part. Now, the type of relationship that these people had with their first heterosexual partner was pretty typical. I mean, it was almost always with a friend or a girlfriend or a first wife or basically the sorts of people with whom you would associate your first time. There were some other varieties involved, and you can see those in the pie charts provided with this video. But, for the most part, those who did have heterosexual intercourse did so with the usual targets, let's say. Now, when it came to the number of heterosexual partners, unfortunately, I'm not able to get a chart of that because there's just too much variation involved in the numbers, and without the actual data in front of me, I can't really find a way to present that honestly without being somehow misleading. For example, among men, they reported from 0 to over 3,500 sexual partners, heterosexual partners. So make of that what you will. There was a lot of variation, or some of them were dishonest, perhaps, but I don't doubt that there are people out there who've had sex with 3,000 women. So moving on, when it came to homosexual contact, there was a lot more of it among the zoophiles than among the general population. On average, the men had it first at the age of around 16 or so, with a standard deviation of 9.5 years, and the women first had it around the age of 19 with a standard deviation of about 8 years. So, basically, there was a lot of homosexual contact in this group. And when it came to the relationship that they had with those who they had homosexual contact with, for men and women, the main source of homosexual contact was just a friend. Somebody, giving them a helping hand or helping them in other ways. So really it wasn't so much that they were not allowed to, well, let me put it this way. They weren't, in general, very serious about their homosexual contacts in the same way that they were in their heterosexual ones. Now, when it came to abuse and incest, as it turns out, there's a significant amount of it reported by the people in this study. Not amazingly large numbers, but enough to be somewhat concerned about it, and to ask questions about whether it had anything to do with their zoosexuality. I mean, there were relatively high rates of emotional abuse and physical abuse, some sexual abuse, and, to be frank, a lot of incest compared with the general population. At least compared with what most people are willing to report. Now, I should add that Miss Miletski's prior work was on mother-son incest, and so there may be some mixing of sample population there. I don't think there is, but it's possible that the same people who were in incestuous relationships had also taken part in zoophilic ones. And when it came to who they tended to have incestuous relationships with, for the most part it wasn't a sort of abusive power structure thing. For the most part it was with a sister or a cousin or a brother, and in general, it was sexual experimentation. It was pretty light and didn't involve anything that serious. So that's it for this video. Join me next time when I look at the current sexual behaviors of the zoophiles in this study population. This is the Erudite Carnophile signing off.